So, welcome everybody. I want to spend some time today with lessons of African American history, talking about Abraham Lincoln. And I want to talk about the question of the way we remember him as the great emancipator. I want to pose the question, is Abraham Lincoln truly the great emancipator, or should someone else be given credit for African Americans' freedom during that time? I'm going to use one of my favorite books in college. It's entitled There is a River, The Black Struggle for Freedom in America. And I'm going to use this book to then raise some questions, to actually talk about some things relative to the history of that period, Abraham Lincoln and the positions that he held, and then some of the other events that were going on during that time. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I want to spend some time with each of you relative to this, and we're going to go through several passages in this book. I'll give you some positions that I take on the issues, and then I welcome the conversation from each of you as we delve into this topic. So Abraham Lincoln, he's running for president in the 1850s, and in 1858, during one of his debates against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln is quoted as saying this. He says, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. He goes on to say, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. And so, this is Abraham Lincoln running for president in his debate against Stephen Douglas, making it abundantly clear that he is in favor of white supremacy and ensuring that whites remain in that superior position relative to African Americans. He is very clear that he is not trying to do anything to put African Americans and whites on a plane of equality. And so I challenge us as we are looking at this, that during as the country is on the precipice of the Civil War, that the Republican Party, this newly formed party, that many people today are quick to argue that we have more in line with today relative to the work of the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln. He's very clear in 1858 that he is in no way working to bring the races to any place of parity, either politically or in any other way for that matter. And so during the campaign, it is really clear that African Americans, looking at the conditions of the day, have made it abundantly clear from their side that this issue will be about their freedom. That as the North and the South, the two political parties are at odds and incredibly divided, African American slaves and African Americans who are free during this time are working to exploit the divisions politically to ensure that whatever happens as a result of what's going on in America during this time, that their freedom would be at the forefront of any discussion as this country moves forward. So during the bitter campaign and the election, Vincent Harding in the book, Martin Delany is one of the figures, very important figures during this time. I'll talk about him in some other discussions. But Vincent Harding goes on, he says, during the bitter campaign and elections, thousands of blacks broke free from slavery. In North Carolina alone, some 2,000 men, women, and children escaped, including the fugitive from Martin County Plantation named William D. Robeson, later the father of a son named Paul. And so one of the men who would break free in North Carolina would be Paul Robeson's dad. That while Republicans and Democrats or people during this period who are arguing or fighting relative to the history of African Americans, the history of this country rather, and making it really clear that they are not going to be fighting for the freedom of African Americans. African American people have made it very clear that this will be an issue that this country would have to reckon with. And so, while this discussion is going on, the war, as we know, would ensue, with the first shots being fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And what you will find is from before, while the debates are going on, African Americans are running away from plantations as they had always done throughout the history of slavery. Don't let anybody tell you that African Americans were content with their condition. That there was always, whether it was violent insurrection from people like Denmark Vesey, who was not a slave, but saw his condition very tied to the slave, or a Nat Turner, who worked and fought against slavery, and many others like them. There was always a fight against slavery. So people did not simply accept their condition as slaves in this country. But during the war, after the first shots at Fort Sumter, many more African Americans would leave plantations. And as the war would progress, there would be generals, Union generals, who would exploit certain things on the battlefield and try to use them to their advantage. For example, General John Fremont would give an order to end slavery in certain areas. Abraham Lincoln would countermand those orders. So Thomas Hamilton, the editor of the Anglo-African, wrote in his paper, he had heard of Lincoln's decision to countermand General Fremont's emancipation order. And what he said is that the forlorn hope of insurrection among the slaves may as well be abandoned. Because many people were concerned, many whites were concerned, that if this war progressed, that African Americans would try to exploit it and then start insurrection themselves. But because of what Abraham Lincoln did to countermand this order by General Fremont, Thomas Hamilton would say that the forlorn hope of insurrection among the slaves may as well be abandoned. They are too well informed, talking about the slaves, and too wise to court destruction at the hands of the combined Northern and Southern armies. For the man who had reduced back to slavery the slaves of the rebels in Missouri would order the Army of the United States to put down a slave insurrection in Virginia or Georgia. And so again, as African Americans are looking at the handwriting on the wall, this man that people would later begin to call the Great Emancipator, and even African Americans would give him credit once he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. We will talk about that here in a moment. would give Abraham Lincoln some credit for the things that are taking place. But as the war is progressing, as Abraham Lincoln is making it very clear where he stands on the issues, they do not put the African American slave, they do not put their destiny in the hands of Abraham Lincoln. They will not put their future in the hands of radical white Republicans, the radical Republicans. They will take their future into their own hands, and they would, and I'll show you how they do it. I'll show you how it happens. They will then force Abraham Lincoln into glory based on what is transpiring in the war, and then also what they are dealing with and how they will use Abraham Lincoln and the things that will transpire for their own freedom. As African Americans are walking off plantations, as African Americans are pushing for their own freedom, they are forcing the hand of politicians in this country. It will be incredibly hard to go back to anything that looked like slavery prior to the Civil War. In light of all of the lives that would be lost, in light of all of the challenges that this country would find itself in the 4 years of the Civil War, it would be incredibly difficult to go back to what America looked like in 1860. And so, while all of these things are going on, African Americans are still walking off of plantations. And so Vincent Harding will go on, as the guns resounded across the southern lands, the movement of black folk out of slavery began to build. Quickly it approached and surpassed every level of force previously known. Eventually, the flood of fugitives amazed all observers and dismayed not a few, as it sent waves of men, women, and children rushing into the camps of northern armies. In this overwhelming human movement, black people of the South offered their own response to the war, to its conundrums and mysteries. Their actions testified to their belief that deliverance was indeed coming through the war. But for thousands of them, it was not a deliverance to be bestowed by others. Rather, it was to be independently seized and transformed through all the courage, wisdom, and strength of their waiting black lives. So what Harding is arguing here, and I agree with him, is that African Americans were not waiting on Abraham Lincoln. African Americans were not waiting on the radical Republicans. African Americans were not waiting until the outcome of the war was secured. African Americans were making it certain that everybody knew where they stood on this issue. And so they were not going to wait for anybody relative to what their fates would be, but that they would work to force the issue on their own. And so every day, African Americans would make their ways to northern lines in every condition, in every season of the year, in every state of health. Children would come, Harding would contend. Children came wandering, set in the right direction by falling, dying parents who finally knew why they had lived until then. Women would come, stumbling and screaming, their wombs bursting with the promise of new and free black life. Old folks who had lost all track of their age, he would continue, who knew only that they had once heard of a war against the redcoats, also came some blind, some deaf, yet no less eager to taste a bit of that long anticipated freedom of their dreams. No more auction blocks, no more driver's lash. And so they would continue to leave the plantations. And so Abraham Lincoln, though, in the midst of all of this, he's still holding true to his position that he is not going to sacrifice the white nation at the expense of black freedom. He was not trying to divide the white union on the issue of the lives or the black freedom, the lives of black people. And so Frederick Douglass, frustrated with Abraham Lincoln, would write in the summer of 1862 in his newspaper, quote, "Abraham Lincoln is no more fit for the place he holds than was James Buchanan." He would go on to say the country is destined to become sick of both of them, meaning General George McClellan and Abraham Lincoln. He says, and the sooner, the better. The one plays for the benefit of the rebels, and the other handles the army for the benefit of the traitors. We should not be surprised, he continues, if both should be hurled from their places before this rebellion is ended. And so Abraham Lincoln, and so Frederick Douglass expresses his frustration with Abraham Lincoln because he's not using the power of his office to the benefit of the slaves, even though the southern states are now in rebellion and at war. Abraham Lincoln is still clear with the position that he holds. And so it's not until September of 1862 that Abraham Lincoln would make the double-minded attempt both to bargain with and to weaken the South at the same time. While replying to the pressures of the North, he finally made public his proposed Emancipation Proclamation under these ambiguous terms: that states in rebellion to the pressures, that states in rebellion would be given until the close of the year, meaning December 31st, 1862. They would be given to the close of the year to make their decision. If they come back into the Union, they could keep their slaves. But if they remained in rebellion to the Union, he would free the slaves in rebellion. And so he would give them until December 31st, 1862, through the Emancipation Proclamation. Any state in rebellion to the Union on January 1st, 1863, their slaves would be free, is what the Emancipation Proclamation says. So what actually was involved here of great importance was the fact that the proclamation excluded from its provisions the loyal slave states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, the anti-Confederate West Virginia territory, and the loyal areas in certain other Confederate states. So if you were in a state or an area loyal to the United States, your slaves were still free. That's one of the challenges with the thing we celebrate Juneteenth. Juneteenth was because of the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, that the slaves in rebellion to the Union would be made free. Later on, the war would end. Those states like Texas did not free their slaves, and then the generals would go into Texas and say, listen, y'all lost the war, so your slaves are free. But that emancipation did not apply to the states that were loyal to the United States. That because those states did not rebel, and so their slaves would still be free. And listen to this, any state that would come back into the Union before January 1st, their slaves would not be freed. So, in essence, the Emancipation Proclamation freed nobody. So, legally, what Abraham Lincoln was trying to do was tell those states that if you did not allow your slaves, if you did not come back, that your slaves would be freed. But if we think about this logically, the Confederate States of America is now its own country with its own president, with its own legal structures. And so Abraham Lincoln, between 1861 and 1865, and as states are being readmitted into the Union at the end of the Civil War, those states are not under his control. And so his Emancipation Proclamation, which said they would free the slaves in states in rebellion, really could not free any slaves in the Confederate States of America. And then those states that are in the Union, who are loyal to the United States, the proclamation didn't free those slaves either. And so this man who has been given this title of the Great Emancipator, through the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, when it took effect, actually didn't free anybody. And so what drove the freedom of African Americans was African Americans who decided that while Northern whites and Southern whites were arguing about what this war would be about, African Americans like Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, David Walker, and others were always made it a part of this was going to be an issue about slavery. So I would argue that the people that we should give credit for freeing African Americans are African Americans. African Americans were not waiting on the governmental structures to free them. African Americans were not waiting on a Congress to free them. African Americans were not waiting on the president. African Americans took their destiny into their own hands, and they were pushing America into their destiny of what is right relative to African Americans. So what lessons can we learn? What we need to learn as African Americans is that wherever we end up from now, it will be because we take our destiny into our own hands. That we cannot depend on a governmental structure to do right. We cannot depend on a president, no matter who it is, that sits in the White House to do right. We cannot entrust our destiny into the hands of somebody else. We must leverage relationships. And I believe that's what people like Frederick Douglass and others were doing. They were trying to push the governmental structures. They were trying to push the state apparatuses. They were trying to push this country into the right direction relative to the future of African Americans. They were not trying to go it alone, but they were taking the lead relative to their own destiny. So to answer the question, and I would love to hear your position on the issue. The Great Emancipator, is it Abraham Lincoln? Or should African Americans be given the credit for their own freedom by taking their destiny into their own hands? Because this is a discussion. These are issues that African Americans had been championing for as long as they've been slaves in this country. And while there were whites who were also championing the freedom of African American people, African Americans were not simply turning to those apparatuses in order to get that freedom. I would argue that they were taking their own destiny into their hands, and they were pushing this country into their own destiny. So I would argue that Abraham Lincoln, to use a title from another book, that Abraham Lincoln was forced into glory, but that he had made it clear that he was not going to use the power of his presidential position for the purposes of freeing African Americans. As a matter of fact, he was part of the American Colonization Society, looking for ways to send African Americans back to Africa once they freed them. Now that they are free, he was working with other institutions to find a way to ship African American people back to Africa. But what they would find was that the cost was so great that they were stuck in this place where they were. But it was African Americans who were pushing their own destiny. And I will tell you that Martin Delany, the figure I mentioned earlier, and others were pushing for the same thing. Martin Delany would work to push and find ways. He was working to look for places and had signed agreements with African nations in West Africa for places for African Americans to be able to go back to in light of how they have been treated through the legal apparatus of this country. And so that ends this lesson today. We will have more. I pray and hope that you enjoy this particular study. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, any questions that you would have, that you would want me to address in further detail. I look forward to it. And I also encourage you, if you haven't already, to like the page Lessons in African American History, where we will have more discussions like these. I hope that this one taught you something new. And I also hope that you will use lessons like these to have further conversation about African American history and the lessons that we can learn from that history. Take care. Look forward to seeing you soon. Look forward to your comments or questions in the chat for this study. Thank you.